for those who've been watching the previous YouTube will know that I did speak to Sir Frank Moore this morning, and Sir Frank's asked me to pose a couple of questions. So, hopefully into the last couple of pages, Lawrie, you'll be very happy to know, because one of Sir Frank's driving requirements or desires in seeing Expo hosted was to promote Queensland to the world. And in your landscaping work, you concentrated a lot on precincts. And the story of the precincts, I think, is so vitally important to the success of Expo 88. And they're really the points, number 10 on in your excellent documentation, which is going into the John Oxley Library. So Sir Frank's question is, to me, did you get experience of the precincts of Queensland personally, turning up and looking at all these various areas, or was it more from word of mouth?
No, I think I've been very fortunate in my career, which has sort of spanned over 50 years as a landscape architect, and I'd always made it part of my personal approach that if I could, every year I would travel overseas to go to sometimes expos, but just around the world to just see the plant material. I mean, plant material, both native and exotic, has always been just my major area of interest, and certainly a lot during that time, a lot of travelling in and around Australia and Queensland particularly, doing work or projects in various local authority areas. So that gave me an excellent basis, and it was one of those things that as the master plan for Expo was evolved with the team of us doing it, it was obvious that we divided it into a whole series of different precincts, and we had the Australian precinct, we had the Pacific precinct, which had all the nations surrounding the Pacific Ocean. They're focused on the Pacific Village as the major element. We had the temperate precinct of the world, which is basically the European nations and so on. And so because I visited basically all of those, I had this sort of intimate knowledge of what was there and plant material and so on. So, and the best things with Expo, we had a whole series of hundreds of them, what were called bilateral meetings with the pavilion designers. And because they did not do anything, most of them did not do anything outside the pavilion, it was up to us to create the character of the precinct and the individual gardens around the various participating nations. And so we'd have these meetings, and I'd go armed with drawings to say, well, look, this is what we're proposing. We know where your entrance is, where the queuing area is going to be. And we'd always make things that was very simply and easily related visually to a particular nation, whether it's New Zealand or Japan or, you know, somewhere in Europe, who knows, so the Vatican. And so that was the important thing. So we had all these different precincts, and each of them with their own palette. And some of them are very memorable, like the New Zealand precinct, because in working with New Zealand and Logan Brewer, who was their pavilion designer and organiser, he'd organised to bring in these moles of the Carry Pines in the Coromandel Peninsula. And they were huge. They were sort of about 4 metres diameter and, you know, about 10 metres high, I think, from memory. Certainly pretty high, maybe 12 metres. And for all the world, you felt as you walked between these, you thought that you were, you know, in a New Zealand Karri forest. And we'd dressed that up as well with all of the Phormium Tanaxes and all of the other plants that are so typical of New Zealand. And it was fortunate we did, because that queue area was all through that garden. And as everybody knows, some of the queues in New Zealand were 3 and 4 hours long. So it was wonderful that people could queue in that shaded green, lovely environment. And we even had the suggestion of Rotorua and the hot springs with fogging and so on, and water playing. Yeah, so it was interesting. So they're the sort of things that we had to do. And I also remember too, the Japan precinct. That was wonderful because that was one of the participating nations who did their own garden. And Kenzo Ogata was a designated national treasure, Japanese national treasure in his 80s. And it was wonderful for me as a fellow landscape architect to look after him, taking him around to the nurseries to select the plants he wanted, taking him to quarries to get the right rocks and all that sort of that was needed for the detail. And so he did that, and then we did more Japanese gardens around the Japanese restaurants and so on, with clipped azalea hedges and all of the hard landscape of the little timber bridges and all of the things that you associate. So it wasn't only planting that was our responsibility in all these areas. We also brought in constructed elements that just complemented the vegetation, complemented the pavilion itself, and created that feeling of, oh, I've just been to Greece, I've just been to the Vatican, I've just been to Japan, wherever it might have been. And you know, that was the magic of the complete landscape of Expo that was reflected in those pavilions and the surrounds to the pavilions and the precincts in which they were placed.
And I'm sure that Sir Frank is going to be very happy with that explanation. And just before we wrap up this particular series of interviews, can I make a personal request, Lawrie? I know that there are some really great historical narratives in the Japanese garden because its construction was unique. It was made, or it was designed by a living legend of Japan. And it's sitting in the Brisbane Botanical Gardens, due no doubt to your lobbying, but also Ross McKinnon and Sally Ann Atkinson. And it is almost a national treasure in its own right that is still in existence today. And I just love going into the Japanese gardens at the Brisbane Botanical Gardens. And I'm just hoping that you do a discussion paper on that and we can talk about it in length and in depth. It is an amazing piece of history, that garden.
It is, and the only negative part of it was that unfortunately, almost at the completion, Kenzo died, and he never really saw it finalised. It was almost finished, but it was a very hot day and it was just too much for him, and so that was a sad part of the garden. But I think the legacy of his work, as you say, now is preserved for all time there at Mount Kusa at the Botanic Gardens.
Yeah, it is a magical bit of kit. Lawrie, I hope you've enjoyed this morning's interviews, and I'm hoping that it's given you confidence to continue as we delve into the landscaping history and memories of Expo 88. So Lawrie, a very sincere thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much for your work as well.
Thank you.